Welcome to another deep dive, everyone. This time we're going deep on compassion-focused therapy, CFT. It's funny how CFT goes beyond just like typical self-care stuff. It really tries to get at how our minds work,
Right.
especially I think for people who are dealing with really intense self-criticism, shame, guilt, the kind of stuff that can really hold us back.
Yeah, that's right. CFT really offers a very different approach,
Mm.
one that brings together elements of, well, this is what I think is so interesting, Buddhist philosophy and evolutionary psychology.
Oh, yeah. That's the thing I was looking at when I was prepping for this, like Buddhist philosophy and evolutionary psychology. How does a modern therapy even bring those two things together?
Well, it starts with acknowledging that our brains, they're wired for survival, always on the lookout for threats.
Right. Makes sense.
And this threat system, as it's called in CFT, it was essential, way back when, for our ancestors. But in today's world, it can really lead to, being constantly anxious or that self-criticism you were talking about.
Mm. Oh, for sure. I can totally see that. So, where does the Buddhist part come in?
Well, Buddhist philosophy at its heart,
Hmm.
it really emphasizes compassion and understanding
Wow.
for ourselves and for others.
Okay.
So CFT incorporates these principles to help us cultivate a more compassionate inner voice,
Hmm.
one that soothes and supports us rather than constantly criticizing.
So it's like instead of just telling yourself to think positive, it's actually about changing like the way you relate to your emotions.
Exactly. It's about developing a more understanding and accepting relationship with ourselves,
Hmm.
recognizing that we're all imperfect,
Right. Yeah.
and that's okay.
This is really fascinating. So, how exactly does CFT help people develop this like self-compassion? Is it just about like repeating affirmations or
It goes much deeper than that.
Mhm.
CFT uses a variety of techniques,
Mhm.
visualizations, mindfulness practices, even working with the physical sensations in our body. And
Interesting.
a key technique is developing what's called a compassionate self.
Oh, a compassionate self. What is
Yeah.
that?
Imagine it as like cultivating a part of yourself that's unconditionally kind, understanding, and supportive.
Okay, yeah, I get it.
It's like having an inner voice that offers comfort and encouragement instead of judgment and criticism.
Wow. That sounds amazing, but is it really possible to like actually create that kind of shift within ourselves?
It is, but it definitely takes time and practice. CFT is not a quick fix. It's an ongoing process of learning to relate to ourselves in a new way.
Right.
Yeah,
I can see how that could be really challenging, especially for people who are used to being really self-critical.
it can be difficult,
Mm.
but the rewards are so worth it. You see, when we cultivate compassion for ourselves, we create this foundation for greater emotional well-being and resilience.
So we've been talking about self-criticism, but what about other issues? I know you said that CFT can be helpful for a bunch of different conditions.
Absolutely. CFT has been shown to be effective in treating anxiety, depression, eating disorders, and even trauma-related conditions. It's also been used to help people, manage chronic pain or cope with serious illnesses.
Wow, that's quite a list. But like, how can one therapy be so versatile? Does it like adapt to each person's needs or something?
Exactly. CFT is very adaptable because remember, it focuses on these core emotional regulation systems that are relevant to all sorts of challenges.
Oh, right.
Yeah. So, for example, someone who struggles with anxiety, they might use CFT to learn how to soothe their overactive threat system, while someone with depression might use it to cultivate feelings of warmth and connection.
So like CFT gives you this framework for understanding your emotions, and then it gives you specific tools to manage them better.
Precisely. And one of the things that's really unique about CFT is its emphasis on imagery.
Oh, yeah, you mentioned that before. Why is imagery so important in CFT?
For a lot of people, especially those who struggle with anxiety or depression, simply trying to think positive thoughts just isn't enough. Imagery, it gives you a more tangible, more engaging way to access and cultivate those feelings of compassion and self-acceptance.
That makes sense. It's like you're giving your mind something concrete to focus on instead of just like abstract ideas.
Exactly.
Wow.
And the imagery used in CFT, it's often drawn from our own personal experiences of feeling safe, loved, and cared for.
Okay. So it's about tapping into those positive memories and emotions and using them to like create a more compassionate inner world.
Precisely. And you see, the more we practice these techniques, the more we're actually strengthening those neural pathways, the ones associated with compassion and self-acceptance.
So we're literally rewiring our brains for kindness.
Exactly. Now, you mentioned earlier how CFT integrates, Buddhist philosophy.
Yeah.
But I wonder, how does that actually, play out in the therapy?
Yeah, that's a great question. Does it involve, like, meditating on a mountaintop or something?
Not necessarily. While mindfulness practices are definitely a part of CFT, it's not about adopting any like specific religious beliefs.
Okay.
It's more about taking those principles like mindfulness, compassion, and non-judgment and applying them to our own lives, regardless of our spiritual background.
Got it. So it's more about the principles than the specific practices.
Yeah, exactly.
Mhm.
One of the key Buddhist concepts that CFT really emphasizes is the idea of the interconnectedness of all beings.
Oh, interesting.
And this idea, it helps us cultivate compassion not just for ourselves, but for others too.
So it's not just about self-compassion, it's about like extending that compassion outward to the world around us.
That's right. CFT recognizes that our capacity for compassion, it's all interconnected. When we learn to be kinder to ourselves, it actually becomes easier to be kinder to others,
Oh, wow.
and vice versa.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like creating a ripple effect of compassion.
Exactly. And this is where things get really interesting, because CFT doesn't shy away from the fact that developing compassion, it can be challenging.
Yeah, for sure.
It requires us to confront our own fears and insecurities and those deeply held beliefs we have.
I imagine that can be pretty uncomfortable for a lot of people.
It can be. CFT asks us to look at ourselves with honesty and courage, to acknowledge our pain and suffering, but without judgment. But it also provides the tools and support to navigate those difficult emotions in a safe and compassionate way.
So it's not about pretending that everything is perfect or suppressing those negative emotions. It's about learning to relate to them differently.
Precisely. And that's what makes CFT so powerful. It doesn't offer easy answers or quick fixes. Instead, it provides this framework for understanding ourselves more deeply and cultivating the skills we need to live more fulfilling and meaningful lives.
I think this has been incredibly insightful so far.
Yeah,
We've covered a lot of ground, but there's still so much more to explore.
absolutely.
So much more.
Yeah, and the next part will actually delve into some specific examples of CFT techniques and how they can be applied to different challenges.
Sounds great. But before we move on, I want to make sure our listeners are really grasping the key takeaways here.
Yeah, I agree. It's important to remember that CFT isn't about, like, suppressing negative emotions or pretending everything is rosy.
Right.
It's about equipping ourselves with practical tools to address those deeply rooted emotional patterns.
And at its core, it's about developing a more compassionate and understanding relationship with ourselves,
Yes.
which can then, ripple out into our interactions with others.
Precisely. And remember, this is a journey, not a destination.
Yeah.
It takes time and effort to develop these skills and cultivate compassion.
That's such an important point. There's no magic bullet here.
Right.
But the potential rewards are huge.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Indeed. And, as we kind of continue exploring CFT, I think it's helpful to remember that compassion, it's not just some abstract concept.
Right.
It's a skill,
Yeah.
like learning to play an instrument or speak a new language.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
So like any skill, we can get better at compassion with practice.
So, like, where do we even begin?
Well, one of the foundational practices in CFT is developing what we talked about earlier, that compassion itself.
Right, that inner voice of kindness and understanding. But how do we actually cultivate that?
Well, there are several techniques that can help. One is through visualization. Imagine a figure, maybe a wise being or a loving mentor who embodies compassion, and this figure can offer you words of comfort and support, especially when you're struggling.
So it's like creating this internal cheerleader who's always on your side.
Exactly. And another technique is using affirmations. These are those positive statements that you repeat to yourself, like, I am worthy of love and kindness, or I am capable of overcoming challenges.
Yeah, I can see how this could be really helpful, especially if you're used to, like, putting yourself down.
Absolutely. It's about consciously choosing to focus on thoughts and beliefs that support your well-being rather than those that tear you down.
This is making me think about how we often talk to ourselves in ways we'd never talk to a friend.
Yeah.
CFT is like applying that same kindness and understanding inward.
You've hit the nail on the head, and that's a crucial part of CFT, recognizing that we deserve the same compassion and care that we would offer to someone we love.
It's interesting how CFT draws on both ancient wisdom and modern science. We've talked about the Buddhist influence, but how does evolutionary psychology play into all of this?
Well, evolutionary psychology helps us understand why our brains are wired the way they are. Our ancestors needed to be constantly alert to danger in order to survive.
Right.
That's why our threat system is so sensitive.
But as you said earlier, that same threat system can cause problems in the modern world. So how does CFT address that?
Well, CFT helps us rewire our brains to be less reactive to perceived threats.
Okay.
By practicing compassion, we strengthen the neural pathways associated with safety, connection, and well-being. And this allows us to respond to challenges with more calm and resilience rather than getting stuck in that fight or flight mode.
So it's not about eliminating our threat system altogether, but rather about learning to manage it more effectively.
Precisely, it's about finding a balance between those primal instincts and our capacity for compassion and connection.
This all sounds very promising, but I'm curious about the practical applications. Can you give me some examples of how CFT techniques might be used in real-life situations?
Absolutely. Let's say you make a mistake at work
Okay.
and you start berating yourself.
That happens all the time.
Instead of getting caught in that cycle of self-criticism,
Yeah.
you could visualize your compassionate self, offering words of comfort and understanding. You might say to yourself, "It's okay. Everyone makes mistakes."
Hmm.
You're learning and growing from this experience.
I can see how that shift in perspective could make a huge difference.
It can. And another example might be someone who's struggling with social anxiety.
Okay.
They could practice a CFT technique called soothing rhythm breathing to calm their nervous system before a social event. This involves focusing on their breath and imagining a gentle rhythm flowing through their body.
So it's about having specific tools to manage those challenging emotions.
Exactly. And the more we practice these techniques, the more they become ingrained in our neural pathways, making it easier to access compassion and self-acceptance when we need them most.
This all makes sense, but I wonder, are there people for whom CFT might not be the best fit?
That's a good question. While CFT can be beneficial for a wide range of individuals, it's important to remember that it's not a one-size-fits-all approach.
Right.
For some people, particularly those who've experienced trauma or abuse, diving deep into emotions might be overwhelming or even triggering.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So it's crucial to approach CFT with self-awareness and to seek professional guidance if needed.
Absolutely. And even for those who find CFT to be helpful, it's important to be patient with the process.
Yeah.
Developing compassion takes time and effort.
It's like learning any new skill. There will be ups and downs along the way.
Exactly. But with persistence and support, CFT can offer a profound shift in how we relate to ourselves and the world around us. This has been so enlightening as we wrap up this part of our deep dive. I'm curious to know what you find most inspiring about CFT.
What inspires me most is its potential to create a more compassionate and understanding world. You see, when we learn to treat ourselves with kindness, it becomes easier to extend that kindness to others.
Yeah.
And imagine the impact that could have on our relationships, our communities, and even our global society.
That's a beautiful vision, and it all starts with each of us cultivating compassion within ourselves.
Precisely. And as we continue our exploration of CFT, I'd like to share a quote from the Dalai Lama that I find particularly relevant.
Okay.
He says, "If you want others to be happy, practice compassion. If you want to be happy, practice compassion."
That quote really speaks to the interconnectedness of compassion. Our own happiness and the happiness of others are intertwined.
Exactly. And that's the beauty of CFT. It offers a path to cultivate both personal well-being and a more compassionate world.
Wow, that Dalai Lama quote, it's really something, huh? It shows how compassion isn't just like this thing we do for ourselves. It really impacts everything around us. So as we wrap up our deep dive on CFT, I'm thinking about those listeners who are, ready to actually use this stuff. Yeah. What are the first steps? Where do we begin?
I think that's a great question. And, remembering that CFT is about building skills, not just like head knowledge.
Yeah.
It's important. And one of the most accessible entry points really is mindfulness.
Mindfulness. But isn't mindfulness kind of like everywhere these days? How is it specific to CFT?
You're right. Mindfulness it's pretty trendy. But in CFT, it's not just about, paying attention to the present moment. It's about bringing a particular quality of attention to our experiences, a compassionate awareness.
The compassionate awareness. So what does that look like practically?
Okay, so imagine you're feeling super overwhelmed by anxiety, right?
Yeah.
Instead of judging yourself for feeling anxious, you might practice mindful breathing, noticing the sensations of your breath as it comes in and out.
Yeah.
And as you do that, you're bringing this sense of gentle curiosity and acceptance to those anxious feelings.
So it's not about making the anxiety go away. It's more about making space for it and observing it with compassion.
Exactly. And as we practice this kind of compassionate mindfulness, what we start to realize is that our emotions, even the tough ones, they're always changing. They're not fixed.
Okay.
And this can help us feel a sense of spaciousness and ease even when things are really hard.
I can see that. So that's helpful for like the in the moment stuff. What about those like really deep-rooted patterns of self-criticism? How does CFT help us actually break free from those?
That's where another key CFT technique comes in, working with what's called our critical inner voice. That voice in our heads that's constantly judging us.
Oh yeah, I know that voice well.
Okay.
So do we like try to silence it? What do we do with it?
Not necessarily. You see, CFT understands that trying to just shut down our thoughts
Mm-hmm.
can actually make things worse.
Yeah.
So instead, we learn to just observe that critical inner voice
Okay.
with curiosity and compassion, just like we would with any other thought or feeling.
So it's almost like treating that inner critic like it's a separate being instead of like it's all of who we are.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And when we create that little bit of distance,
Yeah.
we can start to question whether those criticisms are even true. We can ask ourselves, is this thought helpful? Does it actually line up with my values?
I love that. We're like taking back our power from that inner bully.
Exactly. And, as we challenge those negative thoughts, we can start to replace them with more compassionate and supportive ones.
Mm.
And this is where those affirmations that we talked about earlier can be really helpful.
So it's not about pretending the critical thoughts aren't there. It's about developing a more balanced and compassionate way of talking to ourselves.
Precisely. And over time,
Yeah.
as we do this, we'll notice a shift in how we relate to ourselves.
Mm.
To inner critic, it might still show up sometimes, but it won't have that same power over us.
This has been so helpful. I'm wondering, are there any specific challenges that people might run into when they're actually like practicing CFT?
Yeah, for sure. A common one is resistance. We might resist being kind to ourselves because we've kind of internalized these messages that we're not worthy of compassion. Or we might be afraid that being compassionate will make us weak or vulnerable.
That's so true. It can be really hard to unlearn those old beliefs.
It can. But, CFT provides this way to gently challenge those beliefs and to cultivate a more compassionate and accepting view of ourselves. And of course, another challenge is just, the time and effort it takes to actually practice these things. Like any skill, developing compassion takes commitment.
So it's not like a quick fix, it's an ongoing journey.
Exactly. But the rewards are so worth it. Because as we cultivate compassion, we not only reduce our own suffering,
Mm.
but we also create this positive ripple effect in the world around us.
I love that. So as we wrap up this deep dive on compassion-focused therapy, what's like the one key takeaway you want to leave our listeners with?
I would say this. Compassion is not a luxury. It's essential. It's an essential skill for navigating life, and for creating a more just and compassionate world.
I love that. Beautifully said. And for our listeners who are, really interested in what we've talked about today, where can they go to learn more about CFT?
There are so many great resources available online and in books. A great place to start is the Center for Compassion and Altruism Research and Education at Stanford University.
Oh, cool. I didn't know about that.
Yeah, they have tons of information. And if you're looking for a CFT therapist, the Compassionate Mind Foundation International, they have a directory of qualified practitioners.
Awesome. So listeners, remember, cultivating compassion, it's a journey, not a destination. It's about constantly learning and growing and being kind to ourselves and others.
And as we wrap up today, I'd like to leave you with one final thought. The world needs your compassion now more than ever. Be kind to yourself. Be kind to others. And watch as the world transforms, one compassionate act at a time.
Thank you so much for this deep dive. It's been enlightening. And listeners, thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.